This is Dr. Oldrich representing Blue Ridge Family Practice. I'd like to discuss and review the major brain regions that are involved in the disease of addiction. Major anatomical structures in addiction. This is a picture of the brain. If you would take the brain and cut it right down the midline, separating the left half and the right half, we would be looking at where the slice was made, looking at the right half of the brain. Down here would be the spinal cord coming up to the medulla oblongata or oblong body. From there to the pons, which has directive links to the cerebellum. Right here would be the locus coeruleus. These are all different important parts of the brain that will be dealt with in addiction. This area right here is the midbrain. Now, if you stop and take a look at the evolution of the brain, alligators and very primitive beasts will have basically a swelling at the end of the spinal cord, and that's about the entire extent of their brain. Through the course of time and evolution, the brain has evolved in a forward and upward direction. There's a shelf of bone underneath where the pointer is right here, and as it evolved forward, it also kind of swept a little bit backwards, sort of like in a figure S shape. If you look at it this way, you can get a better handle on how the brain evolved over time from primitive creatures that stopped about right here. And as you get progressively more complex into the animal tree, so to speak, human beings, will have the cerebral cortex that's very, very enlarged. Smaller, more primitive species, less evolved species will not have this large of a cerebral cortex. The ventral tegmental area is right in here. The hippocampus right there. The amygdala is the center of emotions. Mesocortical projections. Meso basically means middle or from the very central portion of the brain. Cortical means up to the cerebral cortex. Hypothalamus is located right here. It's beneath the pituitary gland, the master gland of the body that controls all hormone activity, which would be right about here. Moving further forward and evolutionarily more involved, you get the nucleus accumbens. From there, we get up to the frontal cortex, the prefrontal area, which controls, among other things, impulsivity and judgment. The rest of the body, the rest of the brain, the corpus callosum is a series of lateral projections that connect the right and left hemispheres. The limbic center is part of the emotional center. It's down, projected through the amygdala area as well. The cerebellum is where all of our basic motor coordination and other functions take place, and we'll get into more of that through the rest of this discourse. As we review the neighborhood to kind of understand our terms, let's discuss a few anatomical terms. Superior means to the top or above. Inferior means toward the bottom or below. Anterior to the front, where the face would be. Posterior to the rear, the back of the head. Medial would be middle, toward the midline. Lateral would be off to the side, either right, left, or both. The brain evolved, as I mentioned, from a swelling at the superior top part of the spinal cord into the primitive hindbrain region. With further development, the brain would occur in the anterior-superior manner that I described earlier. Folding would become necessary to fit it within the bony confines of the skull. Later in the developmental process, evolutionary, over eons of time, the cerebral cortex, or cortices, left and right, would branch out to the sides. The medulla oblongata is the middle oblong, the enlargement at the top of the spinal cord. It controls cardiac, respiratory, vomiting, vasomotor, or blood pressure centers. It's basically concerned with the autonomic nervous system and functions of breathing, heart rate, and blood pressure. Pons, the word means bridge in Latin. Its major functions are sleep, respiration, breathing, swallowing, bladder control, hearing, equilibrium, taste, eye movement, posture, facial expressions, and facial sensation. It connects to the cerebellum for motor coordination and other functions. The locus coeruleus is between the pons and the cerebellum. There are many changes in this part of the brain that happen with those prone to addiction. These changes are passed along genetically. The midbrain is a relatively new part of the brain, developed over the past 250 million years, that's new, after the appearance of the hindbrain, which preceded it. The midbrain includes the emotional and behavioral centers, the limbic system composed of the amygdala and hippocampi. They are on both sides of the brain. The functions of the midbrain: vision, hearing, motor control, sleep, wake, arousal, alertness, and temperature regulation. The diencephalon, or forebrain, it's up toward the top of that S curve that we talked about and below the corpus callosum. This is still considered somewhat primitive brain because the cerebral cortex has not yet been reached. That's the home of the higher intelligent functions. The diencephalon contains the thalamus, which can be thought of as a router or switchboard where a lot of information passes through the thalamus to other parts of the brain. The hypothalamus, which connects to the pituitary, which controls all the endocrine system, hormones all over the body, and the basal ganglia, which are again part of the switchboard apparatus. They're located below and to the front of the forebrain. The basal ganglia and diencephalon in full control voluntary motor movements, procedural learning, things that we do like by hand tying our shoes. Routine behaviors or habits are formed in this part of the brain. Eye movements, cognition or thinking, and emotion. As you can see then, habits happen in a very primitive part of the brain, relatively speaking. So this is why you can teach cats, dogs, even reptiles to do certain little tricks at times. It doesn't require the higher brain functions to get into the habit of doing certain things on certain stimuli. Unfortunately, addiction is thus a very deeply rooted part of our behaviors and brain. The cerebellum at the back of the brain is a finely convoluted, much more than the cerebral cortex. Internally, if you section it, you will see what's called the arbor vitae, or tree of life. These are all different connections going from different processing areas in the cerebellum and keeping everything moving. The cerebral cortices, the top of the brain, developed about 200 million years ago. This is the newest part of the brain. Obviously, it seems like we're overdue for an upgrade. It's responsible for the higher cognitive functions, language, thinking, all related forms of information processing. Other important aspects of the brain: the cerebrospinal fluid surrounds the outside of the brain, acting as a cushion or shock absorber, providing nourishment to the brain. It also drains through the ends of the spinal nerves into the lymphatic system, which ultimately brings that fluid to the heart, where it's redistributed through the body and to the kidneys for excretion. Inside of the brain, there are hollow cavities called ventricles that are also filled with the cerebrospinal fluid. The spinal fluid is produced in these choroid plexuses that are located within the ventricles. The purpose of these big hollow ventricles filled with the fluid is to help absorb any mechanical forces and protect the brain from any real bad trauma.